Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jubin Rabbani. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology and one of the co-organizers for today's event. I would also, before we get started, I'd like to thank my fellow co-organizers, Montana Stone, Sonia Vora, and Chandler Morris, in addition to the IBIS staff, Lily Lustig, Jill Olette, and Jess Warrington, our faculty mentor, Dr. James Kellner, in addition to the media, facilities, and catering teams for making today's event possible. Today's lecture is part of a broader series that we have through IBIS called the Brown Seminar Series on Environment and Society, which brings scholars and practitioners together to engage urgent environmental questions where academic inquiry, culture, and policy converge. The series aims to cultivate rigorous cross-disciplinary dialogue that deepens understanding while confronting the real-world stakes of environmental change. Discussions like today are essential, not only for advancing research, but for clarifying its implications and shaping pathways towards substantive, accountable action. It is my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Thea Riofrancos, Professor of Political Science at Providence College, Strategic Co-Director of the Climate and Community Institute, and Fellow at the Transnational Institute. Her research explores resource extraction, climate change, the energy transition, the global lithium sector, green technology, social movements, and the Latin American left. Many of you will know her award-winning book, Resource Radicals, From Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, as well as her co-authored book, A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Her scholarship appears in leading journals, including Perspectives on Politics, World Politics, and Global Environmental Politics, and her public writing has been featured in outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy. Her latest book and topic of today's talk, Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism, examines how the push for green technologies is reshaping global frontiers of extraction and political struggle. She has been recognized with numerous awards, including an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard, and has held visiting positions in Chile, Ecuador, and at the University of Notre Dame, and most recently at the University of Vienna. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. Following her talk, we'll have a brief Q&A session, followed by a reception just outside of this room here. For now, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Dr. Thea Riofrancos.
Okay. Hopefully we're good on the microphone. It's on my body over here. Let me know if not. And yeah, I'll get started into the main talk in a moment, but I like to give just a couple of overarching statements about what I'll be doing, especially knowing that this is a very interdisciplinary audience and with different knowledge and backgrounds and life experiences. And so this talk will be a kind of 40,000-foot view of the book in the sense that I try to go everywhere the book goes, which is a lot to do in 40 minutes, but I'll do my best. So there are moments that will be a bit briefer or more conceptual, and then other moments where we'll get more into the weeds and a little bit more concrete. Maybe the other just quick thing to say is that I'm a political scientist by training, as you mentioned, but I'm have a lot of interdisciplinarity in my background, and this book is probably pushed at my own boundaries and kind of got me into some hard and natural sciences, as well as political economy and other things. But again, depending on where you're sitting in the university or in your life experience, some things might be a little technical or a little outside of your area. Other things will be, I think, easy for anyone to understand in this room. I love questions, not maybe during the talk, it's not that type of format, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to clarify anything. So no such thing as a bad question, but I'll do my best to make it intelligible and interesting to everybody. So just to get started and maybe situate us in the basic problems and dilemmas and questions that motivated my book, we're looking here at one of many different forecasts that you can find on the internet that tell you how much mining is ostensibly needed in order to have an energy transition. We know that an energy transition in which we actually move away from fossil fuel energy and their carbon emissions towards zero emissions and specifically renewable energies is necessary to avert the worst scenarios of global warming, We might also know, depending on our background, that the transportation sector and the energy sector are the two biggest sources of carbon emissions, whether we look domestically or we look globally. In the US in particular, transportation is the #1 in terms of our carbon footprint. And so decarbonizing, getting the carbon emissions out of transportation is essential, and the commercially and technologically prevailing way to do that right now is electric vehicles, which we're, I think, familiar with. We have seen them around. We may have seen commercials for them. Last year's Super Bowl had a bunch, and we may have driven one. For electric vehicles and for their batteries in particular, a lot of mining is necessary. Exactly how much is something that I'll circle back to at the end of this talk, so there's no natural law of exactly how much mining we need to do. But again, there's prevailing technologies and the mineral inputs they require. So what this graphic is telling us is that we will need 400 new mines globally, wherever they sit, in the next 10 years in order to furnish the raw materials of just the battery of electric vehicles. And I'm emphasizing that with some precision because the whole car, the steel, the aluminum, that's a lot of mining. The electric motor, which is separate from the battery, has a lot of rare earths in it, something that's been in the news recently, the rare earths geopolitics. This is the battery and most, but not all, of the mineral inputs that it requires. And so it's a subset of a subset because we can zoom out from the car and go to the solar panels or the wind turbines or the transmission lines. All of those physical aspects of an energy transition also require mining. So this is just a little slice of what mining is required, but it's a lot because some people in the room may know that mines take a long time to build for various reasons. They're really difficult types of economic enterprises. And so 400 mines, this was taken in maybe 2022, 23, or maybe partway into this process, but wherever we're exactly at in this goal of 400 mines, it takes much longer than 10 years to build your average mine, right? So this is going to be logistically difficult, putting aside any other impacts or concerns that we might have. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to say about this is that this is very cute. This is like Microsoft Word clip art, like a mine. It's a little triangle, or it's like a little circle or something. That's not what mines look like. And this really doesn't give us insight into the physical plant of a mine, the landscapes that they sit in, and the communities and ecologies and water systems that they interact with and maybe also harm and contaminate. And so what does an actual mine look like? This is one type of mine. It's also kind of on the cover of my book, a different angle of the same landscape. This is in Chile in the Atacama Desert, the northern reaches of Chile, and that's where about 20% of global lithium comes from. And lithium, again, is on here as one of the critical ingredients of lithium-ion batteries that power electric vehicles. So this is where 20% of that comes from. And it's a little bit odd if you have any image in your head of a mine, this is not what it looks like, because this is a brine deposit. It's a liquid deposit. The ions are suspended or dissolved within that brine. It's subsurface brine underneath the salt flat. This whole salt flat is 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island. It's the 3rd largest salt flat in the world and the largest in Chile of many dozens of salt flats. And many of those salt flats have lithium-rich brine underneath them. So it's pumped to the surface, and then it's arrayed in these enormous evaporation ponds in which the sun does a lot of the work of evaporating the water out of it so that you have a more concentrated lithium liquid that then enters into chemical refining and further downstream supply chains. But again, not your average mine in your head, but lithium comes in all sorts of forms. So there's hard rock lithium of a more traditional sort in Australia. There's clay lithium in the US Southwest. Lithium is a promiscuous kind of element that binds in different compounds. So the deposits take a lot of different forms. Now, one way to look at an extractive frontier, which is a term I use in the book quite a bit, is just like the mining and the extractive piece. And that's what I just showed you. But an extractive frontier is much more than the actual extraction. It exceeds that. There's life forms and life worlds and communities and habitats and watersheds. And so this is, I think, about 30 miles out. So on that same salt flat, it's huge, right? 2/3 the size of the state that we're in. About 30 miles away, there's a nature preserve. And so same environment, same salt flat, but protected. And so there we get these beautiful flamingos that are snacking on brine shrimp that live in the salty lagoons on the surface of the mine, again, or the surface of the salt flat. Underneath the salt flat is where the lithium-rich water is, but on the surface, there's all sorts of salty surface lagoons, and that's where these migrating birds hang out. And then I just give you a different vantage point. These are my fieldwork photographs, so this is from the kind of standing view versus the aerial view. it's an extraordinary, beautiful landscape, and it's not surprising that this is Chile's top tourist destination, one of the two, there and the Patagonia kind of glaciers region. And, lest I make you think that this is a terra nullius or like a landscape devoid of humans or human communities, that's not at all the case. If you go, the salt flat itself is not really a place you can live because there isn't immediate fresh water. But as you go to the perimeter, the freshwater aquifers begin, and you have 18 indigenous Atacameño communities that live around the perimeter of the salt flat. And in every salt flat, that's the case. There are communities that live nearby. I'm just talking about this particular Atacama salt flat that's the largest in Chile. And they engage, perhaps surprisingly, in quite amazing forms of small and medium-scale agriculture. The reason that might be surprising is that this is the driest desert on Earth. And so to actually get this level of harvest and complexity and diversity of crops out of like a quite arid environment is an amazing feat of ancestral knowledge passed off over thousands and thousands of years of indigenous habitation, and actually quite a bit of indigenous trade and cultural exchange between different groups in the region. So this is testament to that. But all of this is under threat by what I started with, which is the scale of mining required by prevailing approaches to the energy transition. The lithium mining is shown to have impacts on biodiversity, reducing flamingo populations. It has increasingly well-evidenced impacts on the water system, so the freshwater system around it is actually impacted by the amount and volume of brine extraction. It has impacts that are more social in terms of people's livelihoods, being able to sustain these livelihoods, the social fabric, how mining and extractivism affects that. And it has impacts more broadly on the kind of economy of Chile and different boom and bust cycles and the volatility of these sectors. And so we might ask, given the ecological harm, the social harm, the political and economic volatility of the lithium sector, why do we need so much of it? Why is it so important? Why is it considered so quote unquote critical? Because ostensibly we'd want like a reasonable trade-off there. Like if all of this is going to be harmed, this beautiful, unique landscape and the people that call it home, then we might ask, to what end? And the main reason is where I kind of, again, started this talk, which is that lithium is a currently non-substitutable ingredient in, those named after the element lithium-ion batteries. That doesn't mean there's no other type of battery in the world. There are older battery technologies. There's newer battery technologies that are kind of on the horizon, and I'm happy to talk about those. But for now, most batteries, whether in our cell phones or laptops, most rechargeable batteries, I should say, in our cell phones, laptops, vehicles, e-bikes, e-buses are lithium-ion batteries. And for the reasons that I said about the energy transition and projected EV demand over time, the demand for lithium is expected to skyrocket. In fact, of those different mineral sectors that I showed you a little bit at the beginning, it needs to grow the most because it was a mining sector really to provide an element to consumer electronics, like again, the cell phones, the laptops, that's like its origins kind of as a sector, or its more recent use as a sector. Scaling out to decarbonize the $3 trillion global auto sector is like a whole new order of magnitude in terms of what the level of raw materials that we're talking about. And so whether you look at the International Energy Agency, the World Bank, Benchmark Minerals, the Bloomberg News, like any of these entities that forecast future demand, they're all like lithium needs to grow by 5-fold, by 10-fold, by 50-fold, depending on the time frame that we're looking at. And the vast majority of that demand for now, this is on the right side with the blue, is for individual passenger electric vehicles, because there's even other types of electric mobility, which I'll reference at the end of this talk, e-bikes, e-buses, but that's not where the main demand is coming from. I'll just mention one other thing for those of you like interested in the energy transition in the room. There's another growing use case for lithium-ion batteries, which is to stabilize energy grids. So an energy grid that has renewable energy means that it has intermittent energy because the sun is only shining during the day, the wind is blowing when it blows, and even beyond that, the peak levels of supply might not be when peak demand is. So you need a storage mechanism. The same reason it's nice to store energy on our cell phone so we can like use it elsewhere, not having it plugged in. And so storage and calibration of supply and demand and these huge lithium batteries on energy grids and now in data centers for AI. So this is from a few years ago. Today, I think you'd see even slightly larger segments for the energy storage and the data center AI uses as well. So it's like a lot of growing lithium demand, in short, but the passenger electric vehicles are still the main source of that demand. And so we might ask, like, is there enough lithium to satisfy this demand? This is a very logical question to ask. And, it turns out our Earth is bountiful, it's capacious, it's abundant. Even as we keep destroying elements of the Earth, the actual mineral substrate of the Earth is really abundant. And lithium is a great example of that. It's the, I think, 30th most abundant element in the periodic table. There's a lot of lithium. There's lithium in the ocean at low concentrations. There's, as I said, clay deposits, hard rock deposits, brine deposits, geothermal brine deposits, all types of lithium deposits, a lot in the US. However, as anyone that's ever worked on extractive sectors, so oil and mining primarily, you might know that the map of actual supply, what geologists call the geological occurrence of a mineral, is distinct from the map of actual production of that mineral. Meaning there are many fewer places that have mines and have those mining sectors developed than there could potentially be based on the actual physical deposits. And what that tends to result in, again, this is not specific to lithium, though lithium's a quite dramatic case of it, is supply and demand imbalances, right? You might have moments where there's a lot of demand, but the supply from the 5 countries that produce it is limited. You might have the flip side too, where there's a lot of interest in something, it spurs more supply, but then demand slows down. And so what that all results in is a lot of price volatility. So lithium rises, it crashes, and a few different of those types of forecasting agencies that I mentioned have, and kind of commodity analytic or commodity research entities have called lithium the most volatile element of the past decade because the supply and demand has gone so up and down. And one reason for that is germane to the broader point of this talk, is that lithium is a very policy-dependent mining sector because it really depends on how much governments are pushing electric vehicle adoption and deployment, pushing maybe AI and data centers, pushing the military also uses of lithium in drone warfare. And so there's a way in which, depending on the political environment of a given country or globally, we might have more or less lithium demand, including that governments play a big role in also pushing for mining projects, so expanding supply. So there's a lot of politics and geopolitics and also market variables, and those have all been very volatile recently, we might say, a little bit of a maybe understatement. And so for all of these reasons, it's essential input in lithium batteries. Lithium batteries are a really important technology across the energy transition and in other digital technologies. Supply and demand have been out of whack oftentimes. Prices have been volatile. All of these makes lithium a so-called critical mineral. And that's a technical term used by the US government, a number of other governments. They keep lists and catalogs of what are all the critical minerals. And those are generally defined as any mineral that's important to quote unquote national security and to the economy writ large, and where there's a concern about supply. Supply is disrupted, it's vulnerable, it's concentrated, all of our enemies have the lithium, in this national security framework. And so that's what lands lithium on this list, actually under the first Trump government. I might come back to that fact in a moment, but that, lithium gets added, it's a critical mineral. But, one of the first arguments, because I've just described a bunch of empirical reality, that's been purely descriptive, I haven't really made an argument yet. And so the first one that I'll make in this talk today is that a critical mineral as a label is not a neutral label. It might seem that way because a bureaucrat somewhere just puts it on the list and it's maintained in some government agency. But in fact, once a mineral becomes critical, becomes seen as critical and labeled as critical, a whole new arena of corporate power, of state power, and of social and geopolitical conflict opens up. Because you basically just said this is super important, it's tied to our national security, it's tied to the functioning of the whole economy, it's the key to unlock the energy transition, the AI transition, whatever, and you've basically made it much more salient and much more important. And as anyone with just a baseline understanding of politics might know, that when you raise the stakes of something, new interests emerge and new contention and conflict emerges, and we see that really clearly in the case of lithium. And so maybe the kind of broader argument is that for those reasons, for these kind of interesting combinations of state power, of corporate interest, and of community struggle and geopolitics writ large, critical minerals give us really interesting insight into the political economy of the energy transition. They're not the only piece of it. There's all that political economy is diverse and comprises many different technologies and policies and conflicts, but critical minerals give us a lot of insight, especially because the stakes are high in terms of environmental and social impact, right? So the contention is just going to be there due to that. And the way that I work on political economy in general, not just in this book, but in other publications, is to think in terms of these sets of actors. So I look at governments, I look at firms and investors, and I look at social movements. And someone in the room, maybe a particular person that I'm even thinking of, but other people too, may be what about workers? They are relevant here. I don't focus on them. We all have to make decisions, analytic decisions about what, this list could be infinite in theory. But it also speaks to something that might be worth you knowing if you're not familiar with the mining sector, which is that it's become extremely capital intensive over time. And so the histories, which are really fascinating and inspiring, of like mine worker struggle and like the mine worker labor movements around the world, from Africa to Latin America to the US, not to say they don't occur anymore, and there were mining strikes when I was doing my research, but there aren't as many humans around. And actually, especially in the Chile site, which was one of my main field sites, it's really like an engineering, chemistry operation more than it is like the traditional like hard hat mine worker. But anyway, other people work on labor and mining, and it's fascinating, but it hasn't been as salient in my research sites as these three sets of actors. I won't belabor this too much, but I did a lot of research in a lot of different places. I'm happy to talk about methodology and how I used ethnography and what I did during the pandemic when that was challenging and other types of things. But it's qualitative research, and these were the sources. And so let's start with governments of that list. I start here for maybe, in part, I'm a political scientist in quotes, and so I do think like politics and the state is important to understand the broader world. But a little bit more specifically here, governments are really involved in mining sectors, and they're really, really involved in the ones that are called critical mining sectors. And these are a snapshot of headlines. I'm starting with global north governments, just as a caveat, and I'll come back to the global south in a little bit. But this is the EU and US primarily being represented here. And these headlines, some of them you can even see 2021, some of them are from earlier, some of them are from 2022. Every time I give this talk, I think, I should throw some new headlines up here so I feel up to date. And I look at the headlines and they're exactly the same. And the reason I mention that is because what's depicted here is this idea from the world of government and states that there's a scramble or a rush, or even a scarcity, even though that's not true geologically, but that we're in a rush, or we're in a race with China, or we're in a race with this or that entity in order to secure our access to these minerals. And while this discourse kind of first emerged around lithium in 2019, 2020, when I started this project, it's only solidified, right? And so this is now a very durable, what I call a critical minerals consensus, the idea that critical minerals are key to geopolitics and key to global dominance. I think I'm gonna shorten this part and not get into it as much, so I'm kind of zooming quickly with the slides here, but because I know we started a little late and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but just to kind of note what I'm doing here before kind of moving on, and it's in the book in chapter 2 in a lot more length, but basically what I want to show is that there is a bit of a backstory to global north governments being obsessed with access to critical minerals and raw materials and energy resources. It's not new. Now, someone in the room will be like, duh, it's not new, colonialism, imperialism, hundreds of years of resource acquisitions overseas. But I'm saying it's not new in an approximate sense. In the 1970s, there was a so-called energy crisis, which is a term I don't love, but it's from a very global north or western perspective, but it was called that. And in that moment, global north governments were like, how are we gonna get the oil? The Middle Eastern states and Latin American states are nationalizing their oil, they're joining OPEC, we're worried. And so they started to develop onshore oil resources. And so even this through line, which is gonna bring us right to the present, of the way to deal with geopolitical turbulence is to have resources closer to home, is a tactic that was developed in the 1970s to combat then called third world states trying to exercise more sovereignty over their resources. So that's a through line. And then you have these other through lines that kind of start in the 2008 and 2016 period of increasing Western elite concern over the ascent of China, and increasingly bellicose framing or militarist framing of China as a threat. And so to compete with China, there's this idea that we have to have supply chains that are domestic, so that we have domestic resources in this geopolitical competition over these new technology frontiers. So, okay, went through that very quickly. Happy to answer more questions about history if people want it. But I want to get to the contemporary policies. And I explore this more in another article called The Security Sustainability Nexus. But in short, what we see governments doing on both sides of the Atlantic, meaning in the US and Europe, and on both sides of the political spectrum, so we've seen this from Biden and from Trump, is incentivizing more mining within the US in this gambit for geopolitical dominance and for economic and technological primacy. And so what does that look like? It doesn't necessarily look like the state literally building mines, right? We do have this capitalist economy and also a lot of legacy of neoliberalism constraining what states do or how interventionist they are. That said, it's a lot of industrial policy that basically adds up to benefits to companies. So it's like if you set up a lithium mine here in the US, you'll get a tax break, you'll get a subsidy, you'll get, even guaranteed in the Trump era, like price guarantees and price floors and these types of things. So it's basically a way to incentivize more mining in the global north, because for a long time, the past century, global north governments have really imported a lot of these minerals, or not their governments, but global north economies have been pretty import reliant, especially in Europe, but definitely in the US too. And then there's this kind of discourse that goes along with it that honestly, and I know this sounds surprising, actually was even in the first Trump government, but gained a lot of ground under Biden, which is it's also more responsible and ethical and environmentally sustainable to mine in the global north, because who knows what they do in China or those other exotic lands. Like, they don't have governance there, they're all failed states. Like, we're going to do it better here. And again, even under Trump, with no environmental commitments, some of his members of his government made this claim in the prior government. And under Biden, this argument gained a lot of steam. And so, we might ask, why are global north governments not just relying on free trade or trade agreements to get the stuff where it exists, rather than building the mines here? And I've already kind of explained this, the first point, which is this idea that we need to dominate China, and China has its own domestic resources and we need to do the same. But also, this benefits mining companies and car companies and battery companies, because they get subsidies, they get tax breaks, they get benefits for local content. And for the car and battery companies, they get more supply, more overall lithium mines are happening because global north governments are incentivizing it. And they're doing so with a battery of policies, and I'll be, again, pretty quick here, but we can revisit in Q&A as we wish. There are all sorts of incentives and goals and milestones that we want to achieve in terms of how much content is coming, how much mining is coming domestically, both in Europe and the US. So a bunch of policy goals that are not hard and binding, but there are different incentives to try to achieve them, the tax breaks and subsidies that I mentioned. We get trade protections. So, okay, we're going to incentivize the mines here, but we're also going to disincentivize mining imports by putting a bunch of tariffs on them, or tariffs on the batteries or electric vehicles. And then, and this is the craziest list that's impossible to read, kind of intentionally so, because it's mostly to impress upon you the absolute slush fund of public money that is used to support all of this. And I would kind of draw your attention, and whoops, this little thing hides it a little bit, further down, because Trump is, if anything, expanding this. And even though he hates the energy transition and calls it a Green New Scam, and he doesn't like electric vehicles, minus his brief bromance with Musk, and the Tesla on the White House lawn or whatever, he doesn't like the kind of broader supply chains of these things or the technologies they're creating or their use cases, but he loves mining. And he loves minerals dominance and lithium. As I said, in his first government, he said, we're going to put this as a critical mineral. And if anything, he has expanded on what Biden did. With Biden, it was loans and tax breaks. With Trump, he's actively taking partial ownership positions in lithium mining companies and other critical minerals. He's unveiling massive stockpiling with $10 billion. And anyway, you get the idea. So it's a huge amount of public money. And in the EU, similarly, though the EU has more constraints around spending, it's spending quite a bit, given that, on assuring local supply, or regional supply in that case, of these critical minerals. And this is having real material effect in the world. It's not just a bunch of rhetoric or a bunch of money that's no one's taking. It's actually changing the map of lithium production. Maybe not as dramatically or as quickly as global north policymakers would like, but still much more so than in the absence of those measures. You have to keep in mind that in general, mining companies just go to the same extractive frontiers. And also the global south, due to the way that people and nature and land are cheapened in artificial ways, and yet they are, it's cheaper to mine in the global south. The operational costs, the labor costs, the land costs are all less. So you have to kind of really sweeten the deal if you want miners to come more in the US and especially in Europe, which has very little mining aside from coal in Eastern Europe. And so what we've seen, and this was from a few years ago, but it's relevant to what I'm about to say, we had this frenzy of new interest in lithium, all due to these public policy kind of deal sweeteners. And there was a moment where there were over 100 projects, lithium projects, being proposed just in the Western US. So this is just the Western US, if you can see some place names there. And a lot of those won't happen. But if 10 of them happen with the amount of physical space that a large-scale mine takes up, that's a huge change to the landscape. And right now, a few of these are under construction. Some more are down the permitting pipeline. And in Europe, again, it would be an even more dramatic change. Europe is almost wholly reliant on imports for its minerals from Africa, from Latin America, from elsewhere. And even building like 10 large-scale mines in Europe would be like a big change in terms of where mining takes place. That just repeats. But the thing I want to make sure is really clear is that global north mining does not replace global south mining. It adds to it because we are in an additive moment of more and more mining everywhere for more and more mining demand. So all of the kind of sticky structural issues of global south providing raw materials to the global north and like that legacy of colonialism, of imperialism, of unequal exchange, of global inequality in terms of access to both raw materials and the end-use technologies, all that inequality is untouched almost. I mean, that slightly overstates it because interesting things are happening in the global south to try to change that, but structurally that remains the case, just as the global north is slightly self-provisioning a little bit more with this geopolitical kind of set of goals. Okay, so we might ask, what are the firms doing here? And I use this term green capitalism in the book, and I just like to say right away that I don't mean capitalism is more sustainable. We could have that debate. That's not what I mean. I just mean something much more concrete and specific, which is the investments and firms in supply chains or sectors that are labeled as green by someone. Sometimes it's the firms themselves labeling it, but sometimes it's the EU being like, this is what counts as a green sector such that you can get a subsidy. There are all these like different kind of classificatory schemes in different jurisdictions of like what's green, or even a bank, like an investment bank might say, okay, we consider this green and we give it concessional lending, it's a green bond, whatever. So here, my green capitalists are the lithium firms, the battery and EV manufacturers, and their financiers. So that's all I mean by green capitalism. And I'm going to only really dwell on one of my 3 points here, but again, rest can be Q&A. But it's the first one that comes up. And one of the interesting things that's happening is that firms are kind of acting like states. By that I mean they're encountering the same geopolitical volatility of a world that feels like outside of anyone's control and a lot of conflict, unlike this new Cold War with China and the US. They're seeing the same world that we're all seeing, and they're like, we don't trust it. We don't trust that we can get the lithium when we want it. These supplies can be disrupted when actors are in conflict with one another. There are moments where there really wasn't enough market supply of lithium to meet demand, even though there was geological supply. And so what they're doing is, and again, this is one of the places where if you're not from an econ or political economy background, I might lose you for a second, but bear with me. What they're doing is saying, we don't trust just buying lithium when we need it. We're going to directly invest in lithium supply. That means companies like owning mines or being a joint car companies or battery companies, like owning a mine, being an investor in a mine, having a long-term agreement with a mine that they're going to get most of its output. So it's not the kind of normal free trade or one-off spot market kind of interactions. What it is, and I take this from my favorite newspaper, the Financial Times, and this is from a few years ago, and it's one of 6 pages. This would be like 20 pages now if they would. I would love them to redo this graphic, but it's basically like these are all the different ways that car companies are directly investing in lithium mines. And what we can call this is Fordism or neo-Fordism. You might remember that guy Henry Ford that invented the Model T, but what he also invented was vertical, well, I don't say he invented it, but he really developed what we call vertical integration, which is that our raw material supplies and everything that's part of the process should be in the same company. Neoliberalism and free trade and all those things changed that, but now there's like a return. It's like back in fashion. And so a great example of that is General Motors, which, as you can see, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the Thacker Pass mine, which is a mine I did research on before it was being constructed. It's under construction right now. And that mine, despite protests, and we'll see some photographs of that later, has been pushed through because Biden, so I'm going to just pause here for a moment to give you a sense of this critical minerals consensus. Under the Trump government, let me start, Trump won, elected 2016, that government fast-tracked this mine, like pushed it through regulatory processes and public hearings during the pandemic, all on Zoom, indigenous communities without a lot of internet access, just like rammed it through. So it gets approved from the Bureau of Land Management under Trump 1. Under Biden, it gets a loan from the DOE, the Department of Energy, that covers 75% of its capital costs. The capital costs, the fixed capital sunk place-based costs of a mine are the biggest capital element of it. And so, okay, 75% off, zero interest loan type of thing. And then Trump, one-ups Biden. Trump, the anti-EV, the anti-Green New Deal, is like, we're going to actually take a 15% equity stake position in this lithium mining company. We're going to do that with some other companies, rare earths, copper. We're going to, in some cases, guarantee price floors so that they have a clear market opportunity. And so you have GM investing, you have Trump, you have Biden. That's what has pushed this over the hurdle of like potential public opposition, all this stuff, but also shows you the kind of intensity of this capital stack that's needed to make a modern mine in a global north context. Okay, so there are other things, 2 and 3. I'm just gonna whiz by them in the interest of time. And so I wanna kind of come back, put things together now. We've learned 2 sets of things so far, or maybe 80 things, I'm not sure, but 2 big topics, which has been what states are doing and what companies are doing. I've already drawn a little parallel because both of them see supply chains through this lens of security rather than through the free trade kind of neoliberal globalization lens. But yet, there's benefits and I've kind of portrayed it as just like an elite consensus, which it is. But elites also have tensions among themselves. And corporations love the freebies. They love the tax breaks, the subsidies, the equity stakes even, because it brings more private finance. They like all that stuff. What they don't like is being told you have to decouple from China, because like half or more of their supply chain is there. And so there's this interesting thing where states are kind of cajoling companies to like join this Cold War geopolitical effort through giving them stuff, and the companies like the carrots, but they don't like the sticks, so to speak. And so that's like an interesting tension point that recurs throughout my analysis of this. But now we're kind of moving into, I guess, the last like third of the talk, because I'm going to pivot away from these really elite, really powerful actors like the global north governments and the multinational corporations and Wall Street finance, and kind of go to other parts of the world and other types of social groups. And the first place I want to return to is global south governments, because I kind of showed you what global north governments are thinking and doing, but what about the global south? The first thing to say is the vast majority of these minerals under any forecast are coming from the global south. No matter how many dozen, 20 mines like Europe, the US, whatever it is, build, still, it's mostly going to come from the global south. And it's mostly coming from 3 like jurisdictions broadly: Latin America, Africa, and Indonesia. So 2 continents and a country are where the lion's share of energy transition minerals will come from, particularly copper, nickel, and lithium, and also cobalt. And so the reason this slide is named this way is because this obvious reality, which is very obvious to global south societies and governments, and obvious to anyone that studies it carefully, is opening up an arena in the global south of new types of policymaking. Like maybe this is our moment to develop, to actually move up the supply chain, to capture more of the value of the global economy that we've long been denied, despite that it happens on our backs. And so resource nationalism may be a familiar phrase to some of you, I'm not sure, but all it means is kind of what it says, which is that the state, the nation, maybe the public sector, depending how it's construed, should take a role in governing these sectors and ensuring social and developmental benefit. And that, again, there's a clear case for that, given how much of this mining is going to happen in the global south. Is the energy transition, in other words, the moment for like real developmental takeoff and for real economic sovereignty that, again, has long been denied these countries. And so what we see is kind of like through the looking glass, or like a kind of inverse thing, where in the global north, it's all this talk of supply chain security and all these security, kind of militaristic national security. In the global south, it's more about development and ownership and value. And so the idea is like, how do we get out of, like, leverage our mineral deposits to get real, as I said, developmental benefit? And I'm just saying development in a normal mainstream. We can critique what economic development is, but here I'm just using it in the normal sense, which is more value added, more diversified economies, more industrialization, more technological upgrading. That's just all I mean by development. And these are the methods that they're using. They're nationalizing, they're banning exports, which is not about banning trade. It's about saying you can't just take our raw materials. You have to industrialize them here. You have to invest in the physical plant of refining, of manufacturing, of whatever. So you create more economic diversity out of your mineral asset. You have, again, I told you the 70s is back in fashion. You have like, maybe we'll do a lithium OPEC. We lithium producers will like coordinate our pricing or our production quotas. All sorts of things. And the hot spots are really Indonesia, Africa, and Latin America. The 3, places that I said most of these minerals are coming from. That's where we're getting the most interesting policies. But it's hard, it turns out. It's hard to undo colonialism just because there's an energy transition, or it's hard to actually escape the trap of an extractive economy when you're trying to actually leverage your extractive assets to do that. So there's a little chicken and egg set of dilemmas that occur. And I won't do these in a lot of detail, but I kind of want to show you the breadth of what global south policymakers, and again, this applies, my research in Latin America, but this applies quite well in Africa and South Asia, what they're grappling with First is it's hard. I just said it's hard. Like, you have the minerals, but how do you actually create a diversified industrialized economy? You need companies to come and do foreign direct investment, but what you really need is for them to transfer the technology to you so that you can do that with your own companies, maybe a public company, maybe a domestic privately owned company. But you need that transfer of technology, and companies from the global north or even from China are not very willing to impart their intellectual property. So it's hard to get that technological learning. Geopolitics, do you ally with the US? Do you ally with China? Do you try to do both? Do you try to be non-aligned? This is hard because once you start getting into economic relations with the US or China, the other one might view you suspiciously, and that can filter into their firms, even if it's a more governmental thing with geopolitics. In any mining economy, so I'm on the third bullet point, there's this key issue of distribution. By that I mean you have this mining, the minerals come out of the ground, you sell it to global export or commodity markets. Who gets the revenues of that? Is it the local community that's suffered? Is it the national majority and this idea of resource nationalism? We're going to use resources to fund development. Is it the workers? Is it state technocrats? Is it a sovereign wealth fund? Where does the money from this activity sit, and who has claims on it? And that is a really contentious issue in any so-called petro state or mining state. And then the fourth, and maybe the most intractable in a way, because it speaks to a core trade-off that simply cannot be avoided, is that mining is socially and environmentally impactful, which is a huge euphemism and understatement. It irreversibly transforms environments beyond recognition and beyond any possibility of actual rehabilitation. You can remediate, you cannot restore the prior habitat. You cannot undo the 2-kilometer pit in the ground. That's not feasible. And the physical waste is a forever waste problem, the physical waste of tailings. And communities and their advocates and allies and NGOs and activist lawyers and citizen scientists and all these people that are kind of part of this anti-mining resistance world, and even just communities that aren't resisting but are kind of aware of the topic, are so much more conscious about these impacts than they were a decade ago or 2 decades. Some of that's the internet. We can critique the internet and all the problems with social media and fake news and all this stuff, but the internet has allowed rural communities to learn about what a tailings basin is, or learn about what watershed impacts are, when maybe they've never had a mine before and they need to understand what the deal is. And so there's so much more resistance than there used to be. It's so much harder in the company's terms, and this is what they say, to obtain the, quote, social license to operate, to get communities that are passive and quiescent, or maybe even excited, and will let the mining move forward without protest. That's very hard, especially in Latin America, but increasingly elsewhere in the world. And this is, as I said, a top topic at industry conventions. And so, if in the past, lithium-related protests was mainly where the lithium was happening or planned to happen, so for example, in the so-called lithium triangle in Latin America, in Chile where we started, and also in neighboring countries, what we've seen is with global north onshoring, meaning bringing lithium home, protest follows. It's not mechanical. I mean, not every workplace has a strike, not every community has a protest against mining. But on average, wherever mining moves, we tend to get more social conflict around it. And so we've had really intense pushback in the global north sites in Europe and the US against these lithium mines, and we've had continually renewed protests in the global south where the mining is likewise expanding and is already a much bigger sector. And so what this looks like can take different forms. We can get the direct action, kind of occupation of land, blockade. We're going to cut off the highway that goes to the mine. That's what's happening on the upper left. We can create a protest camp on public land where the Thacker Pass project is, the one that I mentioned, got all that governmental support. We can maybe get enough of a mass movement that we're filling the streets of major cities. So that happened in Lisbon and Belgrade, and in both of those cases really slowed down, maybe even stalling for a while, the lithium mining plans. And then, we might ask what this looks like in a more place-based way. And so these are the prior were mostly Google photographs. These are, or Google image search photographs. These are from fieldwork. And what I want to just say is a simple thing here, 2 simple things. One is, in my experience working on mining and extractive sectors for longer than I'll say, because it makes me feel very old, but for a while now, is that actually some of the most militant protests, the most oppositional, not just let's bargain to get a better deal, but let's oppose this to court, happens before the mine is built. Because then you have a real existential fork in the road. Are we going to look like this, or is that all going to be replaced by an enormous hole in the ground? Are we going to look like this, or will we have water supply to furnish our small-scale agriculture in the case of northern Portugal? So that's one thing, that these moments before the mining starts, which this captures in both places, are really contentious. However, we also again have a different type of fork in the road, which is that this mine, for various reasons, has still not been built. A big part of that, though not the only factor, is how much opposition there's been. But the Portuguese government just threw $128 million at it in another subsidy and another bid to get the company to stay there and extract. But they haven't been able to move to that phase yet because there have been opposition, scandals, corruption, all these different things that have happened that have slowed it down. On I guess, your right side, that's the Thacker Pass mine site. That's being built. This is not there anymore. That protest camp is underneath a physical plant mining construction. Like, it's just not there. And why? Because we had Republican and Democratic presidents. We had General Motors. We had the DOE. We had equity stakes taken. Every single thing that you can do to propel a mining project was done. And despite multiple lawsuits, 2 protest camps, protests even as far as Reno, it's moving forward. So it gives you a sense of what's needed in terms of elite consensus in order to ram things through despite local opposition. Last couple slides here. I want to, I guess, make two final points. One is that I think this protest is very interesting to study, not just because of my political values or I think that protesters are often onto something in terms of the environmental impacts. I think at the very least they deserve better governance and better kind of terms of engagement of the mine, if not in some cases that maybe the mine shouldn't happen because it's too fragile a water system or an ecosystem or a cultural site. So, I think in that sense, we can view this protest as part of governance, actually filling the gap where states do not do what they should do, which is regulate, monitor, ensure transparent information. These protesters do that. They find the information, they study the hydrology, they use their own ancestral knowledge, they intervene in public hearings, and they create more governance than states do on their own. And I don't want to necessarily say it's complementary because often they're in conflict with the state, but it does fill out governance. And I think it's informal, it's not through the formal institutions that we study in political science, but it is a form of governance. And it's a form of economic intervention because when protest is really effective, it stalls a mine, it stops a mine, it shuts it down. That can affect supply, including in global commodities markets. So it's another form of disruption that's different than the kind of geopolitics that we might often think about. And the last point I want to make is that, if it's the case that on average, again, not each mine, but in general, as mining expands and extraction expands and confronts communities that are more knowledgeable than they were a few decades ago, then, that raises the question of we're just going to produce a lot of conflict with all this mining. And yet, okay, I will say myself, even as someone skeptical of the mining industry, that some amount of mining is necessary even for a radically different version of the energy transition, even for one that was all community owned and mass transit. And, we'd still need some. But how much? Because the more we mine and the more it's a race and a scramble and it's propelled with all this public money and geopolitical force behind it, the more conflict we create. And I would argue that we actually create more geopolitical conflict too with these types of bellicose approaches to these supply chains. So is there a way, in other words, to do more with less? To reach our goals of zero emissions energy, which I 100% agree with and only want to happen more rapidly than they're happening, without as much mining as the forecast that I gave you at the beginning of this talk? And the answer is yes. It's not less mining than today, but when we look at the future, we look at different demand curves, supply curves, and what I'm saying is that when we say we need 400 mines, no, we actually don't need 400 mines. What we need is a bunch of interventions into the built environment, public policy, recycling, land use planning that can actually make our societies more materially efficient, more energy efficient, and more materially efficient, meaning doing more with less. And even at the level of the battery, I know there's some chemists in the room, you can make a more efficient battery, meaning a battery that doesn't need the same volumes of lithium in order to get the same energy density or power density. And so there's so many ways, whether from the hard science perspective, the design perspective, engineering perspective, again, land use planning, transportation policy, housing density, all of these dramatically affect how much lithium we need. And what we found with colleagues at the Climate and Community Institute that I did this report with is that we could, between 2023, when we did this, and 2050, that's just the time frame we used, get to zero emission transportation with 66% less lithium overall, best to worst case scenario. Worst case is we're all driving electric Hummers, we don't recycle anything, we all live in exurbs, we have the hugest batteries on Earth. Worst case, even worse than the present. And best case is we recycle all the batteries, we're mostly taking e-buses, or we're taking more at least e-buses and e-bikes, and that 66% spread. If we go just to the year 2050, which is the last year in our model, by that point, more recycling feedstock has built up. Recycling takes time to really be effective because you have to recycle stuff and then make it available. We have a 92% spread. 92% less lithium in the best case scenario with all these good measures being implemented than the worst case scenario. So it's really malleable. There's no exact amount of lithium. We need some lithium right now. Maybe it'll be sodium in the future if we switch to sodium batteries. We need some of X. But how much and to whose benefit and who bears the environmental cost and who gains the profit, those are all political and social questions. None of them are written in stone. None of them are technologically or geologically determined. And I'll leave it there and take any questions. Should I take questions like myself? If anyone has one, I guess raise your hand. I think there are some mics around. Oh, I'm sorry, Miles. I didn't even see you. I was walking around.
I was just okay. Well,
okay.
Thank you for the thank you for the talk. Really, really awesome. I'm curious if you could speak to the fossil fuel inputs of the mining industry and how your projections tend to energy transition more broadly. Yeah. And I'm sure you're familiar with the critiques of the very idea of an energy transition, the fact that to get more renewables, more electrification, more whatever, you need more fossil fuels, or at least historically that's what the record has shown. So if you could just speak to the fossil fuel inputs and of those different scenarios you spoke to.
I love that question. Thank you. And I'm just coming here because this is one of them, synthetic graphite. Is fossil fuel derived. So, but that's just like a cheeky response because there's a much bigger role of fossil fuels. And I would say that there's two different situations here that we should disambiguate because they're not the same. One of them I think is much easier to just dismiss and critique, and the other is like a more intractable, difficult chicken and egg issue of like moving from one energy system to another. So I think the one that's like easier to critique is this energy addition thing that we're in. So I use energy transition mainly to be like legible to like normal civilians in the room that are learning about this stuff for the first time. But we're not in an energy transition properly understood, meaning we're not reducing oil and coal or like leaving it in the ground or gas and then increasing as a substitute. There are some places where we see substitution. So I don't want to be totally nihilistic about it, and I can get into that in a second. But on the whole, we see a growing energy mix of all types of energy being deployed rapidly to meet growing energy demand. Some of that energy demand, I think, is valid, and it is linked to like development and people getting access to electricity for the first time. So these are the real world issues. But some of it is like, in my view, problematic. Like we have this AI race. We're not even developing AI. Whatever we think of AI, like putting that as a kind of social and philosophical question aside, there are definitely more efficient ways, and we learned this a bit with DeepSeek, but like there are more efficient ways to build large language models that are less resource intensive, right? So whatever it is, there's stuff that like obviously people deserve access to energy, and so some of it is coming from that and population growth, but a lot of it is coming from these new energy hungry industries, AI, electrification for energy transition, other tech industries, et cetera. And so in that push to just expand the energy supply, it's like all of the above, right? We're going to have more gas. We're going to have more LNG gas. We're going to have more trade. LNG is what enables global trade in gas, which has opened up so many frontiers of extraction and consumption of that. We have like a return to coal in the US. I mean, that's a little bit of a weird thing with Trump, but like we do have a return to coal in the US, like more coal projects being incentivized. But then we go to the global south or we go to China, and then we have this thornier issue of like coal being used, and this is where you were going, to like produce the green technologies. We can even get more specific here. We have nickel, the third one down there, that mainly comes from Indonesia. Almost all of the refining and processing of nickel relies on coal power, and specifically coal power plants that are called captive because they're built for one purpose, to furnish the energy for that processing plant. And what that means is it's not even serving broader developmental goals around energy access. It's just coal, dirty power to extract and process nickel, to then go into nickel batteries, to then go into electric vehicles. So there's a lot of contradictions here. And I don't actually think, at least in the US, and to some degree globally, that we're actually in an energy transition. There are some cool things, and we shouldn't, in critique, we shouldn't like ignore some of the interesting positive developments. Like China, its electricity sector, for the first time last year, plateaued in emissions, which might not sound like a lot, like, oh, they just plateaued, they didn't decrease. To plateau while expanding in a world historic amount, the amount of energy supply you're adding, meaning to provide way more energy, just the amount of solar panels they build is like the whole world combined, right? Like, so to provide way more energy without radically increasing emissions is like never been achieved in human history before. All massive expansion in energy have involved more emissions, and so they've flatlined that, which means they're about to dip down. They're starting to swap in renewables for coal in their industrial sector, so there's some substitution actually happening, but it's not to a plateau point in terms of emissions. So we could go to Nepal, like, 75% of their cars last year were electric vehicles. Like, those are really substituting for ICE vehicles, so there are places where we see the greens substituting, but the underlying energy mix is still very fossil fuel soaked. It's like every year is a record profit year for fossil fuels. And I think when I said disambiguate, so I'll just kind of close where I started, we need to separate out, whoever the we is, right? But like we in terms of like people with a critical and progressive and social justice perhaps orientation towards the energy sector, what is just the problem of transition? Transition is a temporal problem. It's a chicken and egg problem. Like, we need to birth the new out of the old kind of problem. It's like an interregnum problem. There's all these sticky engineering and physical things that happen. We can't just eradicate oil supply or coal supply because we'll deny many communities energy sources. Like, how do we scale down? How do those systems keep operating when the oil is much less? Like, this is like the minimum viable threshold or something issue in energy systems. So it's complicated, but those are like engineering problems with like a social perspective. The other stuff is just massive profiteering by the fossil fuel industry. It's massive like capex in the tech industry that is like beyond what's needed from any social perspective. It's the geopolitical race to energy security where LNG is considered to be more reliable supply than solar or wind. And so we need to disambiguate between, I think, the falsehoods, the fake stories, the motivated reasoning, versus like what actually, if we were in a perfectly planned transition, yes, we would not be able to do immediate phase out. That would deny people like crucial sources of heating and cooling and cooking and water and whatever. Yes.
That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
And my question is aligned with the one that you just got. And I'm asking this from a position of, I guess, I'm a bit naive, I would say, about energy. Mm-hmm. But given what you just said, what's in my mind is, how is this ever going to reduce emissions? Uh-huh. And so here's my question. Is there any example in the history of the world of a real energy transition? And let me explain what I mean. I don't mean some small thing like whale oil going away and being replaced with kerosene or whatever happened there. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean something local. I don't mean here we stopped using coal, because the atmosphere doesn't care where it comes from. Yeah. Is there any example of, well, you said mining in the north is not duplicative, it's additive to the mining in the south. Is there any example of a new globally significant supply of energy coming online that actually replaced some other supply? Or is it always additive?
Yeah, so it completely depends how you measure. And what I mean by that is whether you're talking about relative share or absolute volumes. If you care about absolute volumes, which is what the atmosphere cares about and what communities impacted and what, the actual real world material effects of this energy system are, no. I mean, meaning we just see more. So I'm going to quote the name of a book that some of you may have read, and I recently wrote a review of, and it's very interesting. Definitely, if you want to feel bad, read this book. If you want to feel pessimistic, if you're in that kind of mood. It's called More and More and More, and the title says it all. It's by Jean-Baptiste Frazaz, who's known for like his work on the Anthropocene and climate change and climate science. Anyway, he basically shows with a lot of careful research that no, if we talk about absolute volumes, meaning wood increases. It doesn't matter that like at a certain point in human history or each country's development, they kind of transition from wood power to coal to oil. That's relative shares. If we look at the absolute quantities of wood and timber, it's more. Why? Oil-powered machinery makes faster work of cutting down forests. So like you come to the oil age and all that does is mean more wood. Maybe it's not always for energy purposes. There are other things we use wood for, furniture, whatever it is, right? Crates and cartons to ship things and the paper industry and whatever. But the point is that what he says is that if we look at the level of materiality and absolute volumes, we see increasing use of everything over time. But that almost is too simple a point because it's just like a pure addition, which is what I was saying earlier. But he says it's more than addition. It's a little bit pedantic, but it's worth noting, which is that he's talking about what he calls material symbiosis, which is that something that was an energy source gets redeployed as like a secondary input or is something that then is like enabled by the new energy source. So everything just intermingles to the point that now our industrial contemporary society, these materials are all intermingled in themselves. The wood, the coal, the derivatives of each, the petrochemicals, the derivatives of coal. Like it just doesn't go away. We just add and add and add, and we intermingle. That makes it harder to like disentangle. So that's a pessimistic story. I don't know if that's dispositive about the future fully. You know, past is prologue, but not like 100%, and not always, because real things happen, real revolutions, real ruptures, real changes in like political economy occur. And so I'm not totally convinced, and I write, you know, you can read the review or whatever, but I write about it a bit more, but I'm not totally convinced that the fact that we've never had an energy transition means that we never could have one. One thing to kind of complicate his argument a little bit is that even like 5 or 10 years ago, like when I first got a little involved in climate stuff and started learning about these systems, and you called yourself naive, and like when I was kind of in your place, right? And I still have tons to learn, but like, okay, I know a little more now. But when I was first like trying to learn about this, there was a major concern that development, again, the mainstream version of development, just like countries growing their GDPs, becoming more industrialized, more whatever it is, development, what every global south country says it's trying to do, was incompatible with like a renewable energy economy because the technology was just too expensive and coal would just always be there. And like China was often used as a model of this, but we can also go to a variety, you know, South Africa, we can go around the world and show at this moment in time, so 5 or 10 years ago, that the only clear route forward to industrialization, to bigger economies that were more complex, was like relying on the same things the quote West had relied on in its industrial revolutions, namely coal and oil and then belatedly gas. That's not the case anymore. The economics of these technologies have completely changed, in large part thanks to China. I mean, that's a little bit of a simplistic statement, but the manufacturing efficiency and the scale of manufacturing has just brought down the price point so much of solar panels that Pakistan is blanketed in them. And it's cheaper and better for Pakistan to have the solar panels than to keep importing the coal, the oil, whatever it is, which all have their geopolitical volatilities and market volatilities. Of course, the mining to make the solar panels is a volatile market, but once you have the physical thing, you're like, the sun is just giving you energy. You don't need to keep importing your energy. And the price of solar panels is on the floor to the point that many Chinese businesses like go out of business because the profit margins are like razor thin because they perfected like mass production of this technology. And now we see more and more, again, just in a few years ago, this wouldn't have been we wouldn't have thought this way. More and more, it seems like developmentally smarter, cheaper, more affordable to go this green route. However, to Miles's point, what's the underlying production matrix of all that? Does it still rely on a lot of coal on the front end of the production process? Are there still emissions at various points in the life cycle? Absolutely. Is there still container ships with bunker fuel, really dirty fuel, like taking the stuff around the planet? Some of that is helped by the fact that China's now, I hate talking that monolithic term, Chinese companies, in fact, private sector companies not connected to the state directly, are now setting up manufacturing in these countries, partly because global south countries are like, we're not going to be a dumping ground for your cheap panels. We'll make them here, though, if you do FDI. So now Chinese firms are setting up, and it's like hundreds of billions of dollars in green FDI to produce solar panels, batteries, meaning not trade, not like dumping the cheap stuff on these countries and contributing to their deindustrialization or their premature deindustrialization, but instead setting up a factory, because now the country's law says we have to set it up here. There's a local content requirement. So you're getting, I guess that it's a little bit of a roundabout answer, but I would say that the major challenge was never, at least technologically, on a technological front or an economic front, decarbonizing like wealthy places. I mean, they might make stupid political choices that create barriers. But the real question was, what about the whole rest of the world, the mass of humanity that is still struggling to get access to basic things? And if coal was the way for them to do that more affordably, we're like completely cooked. But now, like other things are actually more economic, and that helps. It doesn't rule other futures out, but I think that like now at least we have a broader panorama of what might be possible. And I would say to Frazaz, who has this argument, or to others, that again, that like the fact we've never had an quote energy transition, which I agree with on his terms at least, doesn't mean we could never have one, or doesn't mean it won't actually be in countries' self-interest and in households and individual self-interest to take a different route. But that doesn't mean we don't have impact on the earth, because there are lots of things going in, right? And so when I say I think a lower emissions trajectory in the future is possible because we're doing real substitution, we still have all the extractive stuff. We still have the physical plant of all this stuff. And it doesn't take us out of the impacts, but it does at least it does eliminate the worst case, like the 8, 9, 10 degree global warming ideas are kind of off the table now because of this confluence of developmental possibility and green energy. Yeah, Liliana, and then I'll actually look up more and see the range, and we can group together a little bit. But yeah, go ahead.
Can people hear me? So you talked at the beginning about how there isn't really a limited amount of lithium or various other minerals available to us. But obviously the extraction process is can be incredibly harmful in many different ways. Has there been work towards using fewer fossil fuels to do these extractions? Or, I mean, they are sustainable in some way, as in the earth recreates them? Or is there any sort of...
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. So is there a better way to mine this stuff and how to make mining more green and sustainable? Is that your question?
Essentially, I suppose,
Yeah? Okay. Because if it's not, you can correct me. But it's a very good question. The fossil fuels are just one element of that. Like the fact that a lot of mines are powered by diesel generators. Like the actual work of the mining is diesel generator. You can replace, but to our prior questions, that there's a lot of path dependency in in how mining operates. But I think going beyond carbon emissions, as important as those are, we could ask, in general, can we mine with less water, mine with less land, mine with less social or biodiversity impact? Is it possible to do the mining better at the mine site itself so that all these other problems also don't surface as much? And the answer is yes, in theory, but in practice, hard to make that happen. And so I'll give just one example. One way so let me go back to, actually we're kind of at the right slide here, but let me go back. So that mine up there, the brine operation, one way that tech people, there's kind of this tech Silicon Valley mining thing where new technologies of mining is that's a new kind of sector. So those types of people that are interested in tech disruptions of the mining sector to make it better will say, instead of doing all this instead of pumping all this brine to the surface and letting the sun evaporate it, which by the way takes a year, it's really long. The sun is doing hard work, but it takes kind of a long time. And so this whole cycle is 18 to 24 months. Think about the commodity markets. You have daily movements of prices, and this supply is going to come online in 18 months, and will the demand be there or not? So there's lots of reasons, even from a business perspective, that this is time consuming. But the real thing, to your point about sustainable mining, is that it throws tons of water into the air in the driest desert on Earth. Now that water is not directly drinkable because it's really salty but it's connected underground to freshwater aquifers. And so pumping out the salt water actually draws down the fresh water, makes it harder to access for the communities that live around and for non-human nature as well. So a key question is, can we get that lithium that's just underneath there without this massive pumping evaporation thing? Because that takes a lot more land, it takes a lot more time, and it impacts the water supply, and that all creates social conflict. And the answer is maybe. So there's something called direct lithium extraction, DLE, where instead of pumping and evaporating, you go in underground and you filter with either physical membranes or chemical filters that filter out the lithium ions, and then you can just re-inject. It's like a circular, a lot of quote marks there, I'll say why in a second. It's a circular process, right? And so you don't have to do this evaporation and you don't have all this loss to the system. That could be better. One thorny issue is it's not without environmental impacts, right? So we've already gotten that lesson from me, so I won't belabor it. There's a lot of energy usage in that. There's also sometimes you need fresh water to cool the operations if your underground water is warm, because this all gets at magma chambers, and sometimes it's geothermal. And so it turns out there's all these studies now saying, on balance, we're not totally sure if it's better. But maybe. But then even if it was better, how do you get companies to do it? Because there's a lot of better ways to do things. We could get smart engineers in the room and chemists, which we have right here. We could get design people and urban planning people, and they could say, this is the 15 better ways to do X. But the thing is, the world is sticky. Companies do certain things. They have fixed costs, sunk cost investments in a physical plant that they're paying off with the extraction and export. And so to say, scrap all of that, just a loss on your balance sheet. Scrap all of that and instead do something totally new and invest in this totally new, somewhat unpredictable, uncertain, future-oriented technology. And so the question is less like, can it be done better? Yes, almost always, because mining is a terrible industry. It's on the floor. Like, yeah, you can raise the bar a little bit and still get minerals. But the question is how to get actors that have a vested interest in the continuity of the status quo because their business model and return to their financiers depends on it to change their operations. You need regulation, you need muscle, you need discipline of capital. And then you can create. What's cool about that, I mean, oftentimes people think regulation is like antithetical to capitalism, and I wouldn't mind if that were the case, but it's not necessarily. What it does is actually open up, and historically you can show this in 1,000 ways, like when you regulate and say you can't do it this way, you have to do it this way, then there's a whole new business opportunity in the doing it the second way, right? And so that's fine, but you need states to act against the parochial interests of like the capitalists, like very closely positioned to them. And that's what's hard about technological change in mining.
So we're actually at time, but we could maybe take one more question
Sure,
if
happy
you're
to.
okay with that.
Love, and we'll be hanging out a little bit if you want to ask me something one-on-one.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a very specific question. I'm kind of wondering like the use of the category of critical mineral, quote unquote, critical mineral in the discourse of U.S. national security. Is it like rooted in the Cold War? Or I think you mentioned like in a moment like there was kind of energy crisis or, you know, and as perceived by the Western world in the beginning of 1970s vis-a-vis this kind of newly independent third world nations, right? And I'm just wondering like how the ideas of critical minerals relate to that kind of, let's say, geopolitical history and the history of Cold War. Thank you.
Yeah, your intuitions are spot on. It just starts a little bit earlier than the Cold War. And that's the case with a lot of like, you know, the kind of basics of this kind of burgeoning national security state. Like we even can go back a little bit earlier to see when it gets its start. And the critical minerals or critical materials might have been the term at the time. I'd have to, it's in my book, but I'd have to remind myself because there's a little bit of a verbiage change. Started in the lead up to World War II. And so what's interesting about that is that that was at a moment, especially once World War II takes off and the US gets involved in the whole thing, where we had a lot of state intervention in the economy, like to the point where historians that study that period like call it like a sort of planned economy. Interestingly, you know, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? But like we had a lot of economic planning for the war mobilization effort. And a lot of what war mobilization was resource mobilization, whether the resources were human capital, factories, energy, raw materials, whatever they were. And it covered the whole Western hemisphere. Like in colonial and neo-colonial relations, like resources were grabbed from other places. But the US is big. And we have a lot of domestic resources of energy, of raw materials, of people, and land. And so a lot of it was just domestic resource mobilization. And that was all organized by the War Planning Board, which, by the way, I mentioned, but like really in passing, that like lithium recently has all been about electronics and the lithium battery. But in the 1940s, lithium was also important. It wasn't yet called a critical material, but it was controlled by the War Production Board. All lithium production in the US, by the way, the US used to be a kind of major lithium producer in a smaller market globally. But in the 40s and then in the 50s with the atomic race and the nuclear race, lithium was really controlled by the government, and like all lithium during World War II had to be for the war effort. It was for lubricants, it was for cooling, it was for like submarine cooling, like it had these really specific industrial and military uses that are not its main uses now. But all to say that the critical minerals label and catalog gets its start in the lead up to World War II, gets solidified through pieces of legislation and executive decrees and orders and things like that. But you're absolutely right that at different moments of like geopolitical crisis, wars, you know, energy crisis so-called, like the list gets added to, it gets seen in a different light, it kind of like takes on a life of its own. To the point that now, I mean, Trump, it's just amazing, like just the creativity, I guess I'll say, which is that, you know, he's added metallurgical coal, which is the kind of coal that we use to make steel out of iron. But anyway, he's added metallurgical coal to the critical minerals list. Like no shortage, no problem with metal. I mean, the idea that there's like a disruption in this, it doesn't even fit the USGS's like own definition of what a critical mineral is. But we get the idea that there's a lot of political performance, but that performance has then real implications. Because once you add something to the list, you actually expand. And this is not just my interpretation. This is in the letter of like the statute and the kind of establishment of these different government agencies. You actually expand governmental powers that can be used to advance these projects more quickly. And so, yeah, it's absolutely connected to war, but just a little bit earlier. But it really served the U.S. national security, a lot of scare quotes, throughout each of those moments of war making and crisis.
Well, thank you,
so
everyone.
much.